The argument from design is a massive topic.
You can take it as far as you have the time to investigate it, or to the limits of your intellect to understand the argument. You do not need to be a genius to understand it. Rather, you need the ability to examine evidence and draw your own conclusions, or in other words, the ability to think for yourself. Effectively, you are the jury listening to the arguments made by the lawyers of the defendant, which is the argument from design, and the prosecution, which is the mighty name of scientism. As the defense lawyer, I would like to inform you right now that you can use logic and reason to understand the existence of God. It does not have to be blind faith and an appeal to emotion. So just what is the argument from design? I would like to introduce Stephen Myers, one of the proponents of the argument, to explain it in its most simple form.
My question is this: what is the theory of intelligent design, and why is it so controversial? And why does it elicit such determined attempts to suppress it? Well, I'm a proponent of the theory, so let me give you a definition of the theory, a definition that most of us who hold to the theory would accept. According to proponents of the theory of intelligent design is the idea that there are certain features of life and the universe that are best explained by an intelligent cause rather than an undirected process.
So let's unpack this a little bit. The features he is referring to when he says life is the complex information code that life is built on, which is called DNA. DNA is highly complex, more so than a computer program, and the more science discovers, the more complex it gets. So he is saying that mind is a better explanation for this complex code than the scientism worldview, which is that dumb luck, blind chance, and deep time did it all, and there is no need to bring mind into it. When he speaks of the universe, he is referring to the fine-tuning that is required to make life possible here on Earth. We will cover that later. When I use the word scientism, it is not meant to diminish the name of science. It is important, however, to separate out the science from the narrative imposed upon it. That narrative is commonly called scientism, and it can be quite the thing to notice where the evidence stops and the narrative begins. You will start to see that line for yourself if you do study the topic. Both the proponents of intelligent design and the young Earth creationists believe evolution happens. Anyone who says they deny evolution is misinformed or misleading you. There is a group of people who are called theistic evolutionists, who accept the idea that life moved from a single cell up to the current life forms, roughly in the order that the mindless evolutionists say it happened, but believe that it would not be possible for this to happen if there was no input from the Creator along the way, and they argue that the fossil record bears this out. Then there are the young Earth creationists, who believe that microevolution occurs, microevolution being the observed evidence that we see of evolution through the mechanism of adaptation by natural selection and mutation of the genetic code. They are just fine with all of that. However, they claim that macroevolution, which is where the scientism mob appeal to the fossil record to show fish can change into mammals, etc., they say the fossil record is better explained by a giant flood, and that we were placed here fully formed in a type of orchard of creation by our Creator. On the other side are the atheists, and they have different camps. The main one are the philosophical materialists. These guys are also referred to as materialists, and their belief as materialism, which is the belief that the material world is all there is. This is not materialism in the common understanding of the word. Another example of their camp are naturalists. For the quote coming up, it is important to understand that when the word materialism is used, it is meant in the context of the description I just gave for philosophical materialism. I have paid a high price in my life for my lack of understanding around the design of life. I got quite angry for a long time once I had looked at the evidence and understood just how implausible the scientism position really is. Let's read through this quote. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs.
in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
So let's start with the origin of life. The philosophical materialist needs to be able to explain how life can get started without mind. Whilst their narrative is passed off as science, for surely they have captured the name of science and taken it hostage, it is helpful to understand their story is just a creation myth. There is a lot of scientific work going on right now to produce a single simple cell. Even if we were to produce such a thing in the lab, the scientism mob would have to offer up an explanation of how that could come about without the intervention of mind or an agent of mind. They are good storytellers though, surpassing even Rudyard Kipling. So back in Darwin's day, it was believed that a cell was a simple jelly-like lump of organic matter. However, science has moved on a lot since his time, and we now know that a simple cell is actually highly complex. So what the scientists have done is looked at what they imagined will be the simplest form of a cell, whilst qualifying as being life or alive, and then they have set about seeing what it takes to make such a cell. If you were to follow the mainstream media and scientific publications, you could think that they have all but achieved this accomplishment. They have not. So let's take a look at the video. He has identified here what they call the trinity of things required. The guy mentions in this clip that the cell wall is the most important. I want to mention it is also the most simple part. Let's hear what he has to say.
And third are lipids, which encapsulate the cells of your body. Before any living things existed, before animals, plants, and even bacteria existed, these three things had to have been present in the primordial soup in order for life to start. Some argue that the most important component of this trinity are the lipids, which make up the cell walls. Why would this be the most important? Because without the wall, or a way to encapsulate certain elements within the soup, there would just be a soup of material that would just be disorderly and floating around in a sea of liquid. It would not be functioning inside something that could potentially self-replicate. But because these lipid membranes could potentially form around other elements, they could bring disparate parts of various chemicals together that could potentially interact, combine, react, and work together to perhaps eventually form a machinery for self-replication.
I do need to stop him there for copyright purposes, and just to say it's a great video with fantastic visuals, and despite this guy being all about the scientism narrative, it is well worth a watch.
So these fatty membranes composed of lipids were critical components for abiogenesis. So any study of abiogenesis should perhaps start with a closer examination of lipids. Lipid molecules have a unique structure. There is a round part and a long tail part. It so happens that the round part loves water. It's hydrophilic. The tail part, however, hates water. It's hydrophobic. So what tends to happen is when a bunch of lipids are floating around in water, they tend to gather together and self-assemble into spheres. Why does this happen? Because the tail parts of the molecule, since it wants to get away from water, automatically faces other tails that also dislike water. And the round part, which likes water, exposes itself to the water outside and inside the sphere. It is what these types of molecule do naturally. So it has a tendency to self-assemble into natural spheres.
So now we'll go to James Tour, who is discussing the quality of the experiments that are going on. And it was on the findings of these experiments that this video was made.
The lipids that he is using are actually in some way relevant or similar to the lipids that would be in the bilayer?
No, they're totally unlike what is in an actual lipid bilayer. In an actual lipid bilayer, you have what are called diacetyl lipids. You have a glycerol that you are distinguishing the two ends of the glycerol that are enantiotopic, and you have to somehow distinguish those two ends. And then you have to put on lipid chains, many of them having stereogenic centers that are homochiral. The lipid itself is often homochiral, and it has two chains hanging off. He made ones with one chain without the glycerol component on it.
And were they homochiral or?
No, there was no chirality to them. No chirality.
So they were at least, at best, weakly analogous to the kinds of lipids that you find in the lipid bilayer in a cell, and they were themselves the product of organic synthesis produced by a whole host of very smart chemists.
You're again being too gracious.
By too nice?
Too nice. You're saying they're weakly analogous. No, they're not analogous at all. They're not two chains. They're one chain. And it's been shown if you only have one chain hanging down, you don't have the stability you need for life. Secondly, his two layers, his inside layer and his outside layer for his vesicle, are the same. You could never have that in a living cell. You have to have a proton gradient. The inside layer and the outside layer of the vesicle have to be different. Nobody knows how to make them like that. Only do you find these in nature. Only do you find these in cells. You don't find these when there's no life around. Only living organisms make this. We don't know how to do this in the laboratory. He didn't have the inside and the outside different. If you don't have the inside and the outside different, there's no proton gradient, there's no life. So
so this is really fascinating. So let's just summarize here. So if we go back to our original idea that to explain the origin of life, you have to explain the origin of the kind of things that make life today. You have to explain the classes of molecules that we see in actual cells, and eventually their arrangement and organization in relation to each other. So in Cronin's experiment, he purports to show how, purports to have found a process that is analogous to cell division. It's not analogous to actual cell division. He purports to do so with lipid molecules that are analogous to actual lipids that are used in the lipid bilayer in cells, but they're not analogous. And even to the extent he's been able to make those molecules, the process by which he's done that has been totally dependent, not on purely undirected natural processes of the kind that would be at work on a prebiotic Earth, but rather by the intelligent design of organic synthesis chemists who do organic synthesis in the laboratory. Is that basically what we've got?
Yes, using modern methods of synthesis and using multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment to do the analytical separations and analyses.
So they can't even build a cell wall yet. By far the easiest part, using top-end scientific equipment, and yet to hear it reported, it's pretty much done. The more we find out, the worse it gets for the scientism narrative. So if we're able to call anything impossible, we can certainly call life getting started without mind impossible. What this should be telling us is that our Creator is an orders of magnitude greater than us, but that glory is stolen by the scientism mob. The scientism mob will often say that I am falling into the God did it fallacy. However, it's important to know that they're falling into the eternal promissory note fallacy, where they claim that one day science will figure out how all of this can come around by dumb luck, blind chance and deep time. However, if their assumption is wrong, which to me it self-evidently is, they will never find a path to life through undirected causes. They may well be able to create a simple cell in a lab one day, however it will be with engineering above what we have right now. It is their belief system that destroys logic and reason, despite them claiming logic and reason as their own. It has helped me tremendously to reach a point, by looking at the evidence, where I now see that life is designed, and design is an absolute. In that video, he then goes on to mention the Miller-Urey experiment, which is in many school textbooks. It is a massively overstated experiment that, once a critical analysis of the evidence is applied, shows how inadequate the mindless explanation is, and how devoted in their faith the scientism mob really are. So to sum up, the claim from the scientism mob is that life can get started without intervention from an agent of mind, e.g. humans or God. Their model claims that life originated in the form of a simple cell, which must have come around by chance, no engineering, no forethought. The actual science, divorced from its narrative, shows that even with our brightest minds, our most advanced technology, our greatest computing power, our finest chemistry and engineering, we cannot yet put together the most simple part of the cell. Yet the scientism mob claim that chance can do it in a muddy pond. Make no mistake, the scientism mob will argue skillfully for their position, but once you really understand what they are forced to believe to be true, you will see just how impossible their claims actually are, and that the evidence actually shows that for life to get started in the form of a simple cell, it needs to happen in a highly engineered way. It does not matter what the world and the scientism mob believes. It matters that your worldview is founded on the rock of truth to the greatest extent that a human being can know something. In our modern age, we have all the evidence we need to believe in the design of life, and we should be living in a golden era of spiritual understanding. However, it is up to you to separate the evidence from the scientism narrative and ground your belief in God. The argument from design makes no theological conclusions. Rather, it just points out the evidence for design. Who or what God is, and what we can know about the spiritual life, is an entirely different topic that we will be covering on this channel. I want to keep the topic separate because it is a big deal to come out of the mainstream indoctrination you have been overwhelmed with. Given the state of Western civilization and the sometimes subtle, sometimes overt pushing of scientism into the minds of men, it is very important to ground your faith in true knowledge and to understand the weakness, or rather impossibility, of the position that states life is nothing but a cosmic accident. The small section I've just spoken of on aborigines is just a snapshot of the problems faced by the scientism mob regarding getting life off the ground through materialistic means. The problems they face are profound and effectively destroy their position, but they remain eagerly and willfully ignorant of the rightful conclusions they should be making, given the facts we now know. So the mindless evolutionists will say that life emerged out of the primordial ooze. It is important to understand the word emerged is a magic word that is used to bypass all sorts of problems. It covers the sins of the faithful as their absurdities multiply.